Was King David gay? Some people think so. Let's take a look. Many books have been written trying to defend the view that David and Jonathan were indeed homosexual lovers. And on the surface, it kind of looks that way. Now it happened when he had finished speaking to Saul that the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. Do we have a love story? What is going on? Then Jonathan cut a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. What kind of covenant is that? Some people think it's a marriage covenant. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David with his armor, even his sword, and his bow and his belt. Now Jonathan's taken off his clothes. Jonathan loved David. Jonathan cut a covenant with David. And now Jonathan's taken off his clothes. But wait, it gets stranger. And they kissed each other and wept together. But David wept more. All right, so it sounds like two men are in love and they're taking off their clothes and now they're kissing. But wait, there's more. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. You have been very pleasant to me. Your love to me was more wonderful than the love of women. What does he mean by that? So they're in love. They're taking off their clothes. They're kissing. And their love is better than women. It does sound pretty gay on the surface. Now, this is an example of reading the Bible in context. So basically in 1 Samuel 17, verse 25, says here, it will be that the king, who is at this time King Saul, will enrich the man who strikes him down, who strikes down the giant Goliath with great riches, and will give him his daughter and make his father's house free in Israel. Whoever kills Goliath, the giant, will get to marry King Saul's daughter. So what he's saying is that he killed Goliath and he thought he would simply get a wife, which he did actually later on. But instead he got so much more, he in fact became king. He didn't just marry the king's daughter and enter into the royal family that way. David actually became the king, largely due to the loyalty and support of Jonathan. And I think it's because Jonathan recognized that God had chose David. Now, there's a few things that could be happening here, I think. Most scholars would say that Jonathan recognizes that David will be the next king. So Jonathan is kind of taking off his princely robe that symbolizes that he's next in line to be king. However, Jonathan, the son of Saul, said to the young man who was carrying his armor. So Jonathan had a guy who carried around his armor, his assistant. I think that could also be what's going on, is that David now has taken the role of the guy who carries around the armor for Jonathan. And there's quite a few verses about this. Jonathan and his armor bearer, right? So maybe David has become Jonathan's armor bearer now at this point in time. And then it says, so David went out wherever Saul sent him and prospered, and Saul sent him over the men of war. Now, it's also possible that David became the leader of the army. It could be that Jonathan has surrendered his role of the leader of the army to David. So either way, there's some kind of passing on of authority, of status. David has now entered into the service of King Saul and possibly is like a brother to Jonathan. But the only way to get something gay out of this passage is if you put it in there yourself. It's not really in there, although admittedly it does kind of appear that way on the surface because we're talking about love, talking about a covenant. So again, this covenant could be a political covenant. Obviously, there's some kind of affection there, some kind of friendship. But I think also Jonathan recognizes that David is a righteous man who will be the next king as opposed to his father Saul. He also recognizes that David was chosen by God, so he's not going to resist God's will. So any kind of homosexual overtones in this are actually on the surface level in English, but in the historical and linguistic context of this, we can see that it's more of a story of a prince ceding power and authority to this guy David, who just killed a giant. There's more of a military and political context here, and two warriors. In fact, some people compare this to the Epic of Gilgamesh. A similar thing happens there where Gilgamesh basically makes a friend and they go out together and conquer lands together. But also there's this language of love being used. So it's not necessarily talking about romantic love or sexual love. Okay, this love could be used for family members or even fellow soldiers. And we're going to see people say this to David quite a bit, actually. And in fact, there's another Hebrew word that is used for sexual activity that's actually not being used here at all. So if they wanted to tell us that these guys were gay, they could have told us more clearly. Now, another argument I would say is that King David had a lot of wives. In fact, he had at least 19 wives and concubines. And Jonathan also had a wife. He had a kid. David had lots of children. And as we know, David had a man killed so he could take his wife. If David were gay, it would have been the other way around. He would have had the wife killed so he could take the husband. Another problem we have is to overcome is that Richard Gere played King David in a movie from 1985, and he danced around half naked throughout much of the movie. That's another issue. Now, the first description of David we get is he has beautiful eyes and a handsome appearance. And the Spirit of Yahweh came mightily upon David. Okay, so that's another reason everybody loved David. People were attracted to David. He had the Spirit of God in him, in contrast to Saul, who lost it. The Spirit of Yahweh departed from Saul. All Israel and Judah loved David. So Jonathan and Saul loved David, but everybody loved David. All Israel and Judah loved David. So everyone loved David. Doesn't mean that they're all gay. Hiram had always been one who loved David. So even King Hiram of Tyre loved David. Does that mean Hiram and David were gay? No. It means that David was a great king. People respected him as a king. And look at this. A woman even loved David too. Michal, that's Saul's daughter. And David did, in fact, become the king's son-in-law. So Saul gave Michal his daughter as a wife, and Michal loved him. And that was the first of many wives that David had. Here's one for the gay crowd. Jonathan, Saul's son, greatly delighted in David. But everybody did. All right. And then people will say, well, maybe David was bisexual. No, you're reading into the text. So you have to get back into the original context of royal families and a prince who recognizes that David is the true king, not his father Saul and not himself. And the way they used clothing to represent the authority, and the way they transferred weapons to show the king was the leader of the army. And there again, Jonathan cut a covenant with the house of David. Jonathan made David swear again because of his love for him, because he loved him as he loved his own soul. It's not a romantic love. In this context of two warriors, it's a sign of friendship and respect. It's like, yeah, you'd want to go to battle with this guy. I respect him, and he's God's chosen king. And there's some political and diplomatic overtones in this word love used in other parts of the Bible as well. And it's not a marriage covenant. It's just an agreement between two parties. And then Saul gets angry at his son Jonathan, says, you son of a perverse, rebellious woman, do I not know that you are choosing the son of Jesse, who is David, to your own shame and to the shame of your mother's nakedness? So again, this sounds kind of gay again, right? Like Saul is condemning his son Jesse for having a homosexual relationship with David. But no, that's not what's going on. You'd have to read that into the text and assume that Jonathan's really next in line to the throne, but Jonathan is giving the throne over to David. That's what's going on here. It's not about some homosexual relationship. Something like that is not even part of the story. For as long as the son of Jesse lives on earth, neither you nor your kingdom will be established. So people will say, oh, that's because those guys were gay and they're not going to have kids. No, they were married. They had kids. It means that as long as David is alive, David will be king instead of Jonathan. Saul is telling Jonathan that he should be king. And this is a good example of, yeah, you can see what you want to see in these passages, but what's better is to read the text in its original context and not through the modern day context. All right, now here's another apparently gay verse on the surface. And they kissed each other and wept together, but David wept more. So this is Jonathan and David. They kissed each other. All right. So you could say, if you're going to make the argument that these guys are gay, you have a pretty good argument on the surface. You really do, actually, more than anywhere else in the Bible, I'd have to say. And Jonathan said to David, "Go in peace, inasmuch as we have sworn to each other in the name of Yahweh, saying, Yahweh will be between me and you, and between my seed and your seed forever." Remember, Jonathan is the prince. He's the next in line to the throne. But really, God chose David to be the next king. Two potential kings could have been fighting each other, but instead they had a covenant of friendship and loyalty and understanding that David would be the king. So I think that's what's going on. All of this is happening in contrast to what you would expect. You would expect Jonathan to be the next king. Really, Jonathan's being obedient to God. And then they're talking about seed, right? These guys cannot make babies by themselves, right? They're going to need some women to have offspring. So, I don't think normal gay people talk about the babies they're going to have with women. Now, here's another scene with Jonathan and David. He said, "Don't be afraid, because the hand of Saul, my father, will not find you, and you will be king over Israel, and I will be second to you. And Saul, my father, knows that also." So the two of them cut a covenant before Yahweh. That's about 3 or 4 times these guys cut a covenant. But see, what is the nature of this covenant? It is not marriage. It is not romantic. It is not sexual. It is an agreement that David will be king over Israel and Jonathan will be second. That's the nature of the covenant. David arose and cut off the edge of Saul's robe secretly. So again, David is becoming the king. So the robe is kind of like a crown, right? If you wear the crown, that means you're the king. If you wear this robe, that also means you're the king. So here's a passage where David gets 2 more wives, basically at the same time, 2 for the price of 1, Abigail and Ahinoam, and Michal, David's wife. Now here it looks like Saul gave away David's first wife to somebody else. The plot thickens, and here Jonathan is killed. Saul kills himself. But you notice that David also laments for Saul, and he laments probably a bit more for Jonathan, my brother. He calls him my brother. Now, they were kind of like brother-in-law, and they were friends, and they were soldiers together. They fought in battles together. Even though Saul was David's enemy, he still wept over Saul because Saul was anointed by God originally. David was being righteous. "You have been very pleasant to me," right? Yes, this sounds gay. "Your love to me was more wonderful than the love of women." Sounds pretty gay. It does sound pretty gay. And I know some people are going to still think that these guys were gay. But Jonathan's love and their covenant resulted in David becoming king and fulfilling his calling, and Jonathan saved David's life. So you could say, well, that's probably more wonderful than the love of a woman. But at this time in David's life, there was a lot of things going on, whereas his friendship with Jonathan was probably a lot more meaningful at that time. Now here, David sees this hot woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful in appearance. So David is attracted to this beautiful naked woman. He noticed a naked woman bathing. He was attracted to her. All right. Now, as far as I know, that doesn't usually happen with gay dudes. It would be the opposite. He would have saw some guy bathing and then killed his wife and ran off with the guy. But no, he put this woman's husband on the front lines and had him killed. And he had a baby with this woman as well. He lay with her, all right? So there's a sexual scene with David right there. It doesn't say he laid with Jonathan. He laid with Bathsheba, who was married to Uriah the Hittite, and the woman became pregnant. So what do you do in that case? Obviously, if you're the king, you put the husband on the front lines. He conspired to have Uriah killed. Place Uriah in the front line of the fiercest battle and withdraw from him, so that he may be struck down and die. He didn't even just put him on the front lines. He had it all planned out so that he would be on the front line, and then the rest of the army would leave him alone on the front lines of the battlefield. That is deliberate act of murder because he knocked up his wife. Now, David is a murderer, but he's not gay. And it says here, David took more wives at Jerusalem, and David became the father of more sons and daughters. So this is a good example of reading the original story in its original context helps us to understand what's going on And this is not really some kind of gay love story. And most importantly, it involves God. I think what happened here is that Jonathan recognized that God chose David to be the king, and Jonathan was being loyal to God rather than being loyal to his disobedient father, his rebellious, crazy father. God put his spirit upon David and withdrew it from Saul, and you can see what happened to Saul and what happened to David. And even though David was a flawed human being, he never wavered in his loyalty to God. That's one thing he did right. Unlike his son Solomon, who actually worshipped all the other gods as well. It was syncretism. All right, thanks. See you next time.